So, welcome to the Long Run Phillips curve. Make sure you watch the video on the original Phillips curve, because what happened is the Phillips curve originally worked well until the 1970s. And then in the 1970s we had this huge problem called stagflation, which is simultaneously rising inflation but rising unemployment and a slowdown, or at least a fall in economic growth and output. So we have this phenomenon of stagflation occurring in the 70s, and you can see that the Phillips curve relationship essentially broke down. There was no longer a simple trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And this occurred in the 70s, partly linked to the oil price shock. There were two big oil price shocks in the 70s. So the monetarist has always been a bit concerned about the Keynesian-based Phillips curve. Milton Friedman, Nobel Prize winning monetarist, argued that really what we have is a long-run Phillips curve, that in the long run there's no trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So what he argued and developed in terms of his model is a vertical long-run Phillips curve where there's no trade-off between inflation and unemployment. And we'll come to why he thought that shortly. He did, however, concede that in the short run there would be a trade-off. So basically what he argued, in the short run there would be adaptive expectations, whereas in the long run there would be rational expectations. I'll come back to that. So if we explain the long Phillips curve, it assumes that the unemployment will always go back to the natural rate of unemployment. So according to Friedman and the monetarists and the neoclassical economists, unemployment is determined by the natural rate of unemployment, and that's determined by the supply side of the economy. Inflation can be controlled by the demand side of the economy, essentially linked to the money supply, according to Milton Friedman. So let's look at this situation here. We can have short-run trade-offs, such as represented by Phillips curve 1. So for example, imagine we start at A. So we've got 2% inflation, okay? Say we've got unemployment at a reasonable level. Now say a government is elected, maybe a bit left of centre, but it's a bit Keynesian, and what they want to do is to get unemployment below this level. So what they have is they have a reflationary fiscal or monetary policy. So they reflate the economy. The economy expands, and you have an increase in nominal wages, and so we move from A to B, and at B, of course, there's a lower level of unemployment, yeah, U1, and we've fallen below the natural rate. However, at B, firms realise and workers realise that inflation has increased, and inflation is at 4%, and so workers demand a rise in their wages, and so what happens is firms have to make workers redundant, okay, because their costs have increased. So they make workers redundant again, and we end up back at C. So we end up back where we started at the natural rate of unemployment, but with this additional inflation. Inflation has now increased to 4%, and we now have higher inflationary expectations. So we've moved from PC1 to PC2. And this series of Phillips curves, the short-run Phillips curves, are really related to higher inflationary expectations on behalf of workers and firms, economic agents if you like. And they could be related to the money supply, with a high level of money supply, according to the monetarists, according to neoclassical economics, non-Keynesians. And so some call it, if you want a nice word for this, it sounds good in the exam or in conversation, It's often called the expectations augmented Phillips curve. So you've taken the original Phillips curve and you've added this idea of inflationary expectations. And of course, if we start at C, you go to D, E, a very similar process. So say the government still wants to get unemployment below the natural rate, towards U1. So what they do, reflate the economy again, maybe print more money, expand the money supply. And so whilst there's money illusion and workers haven't cottoned on to the rational expectations that inflation will increase, so they're using adaptive expectation, they think things will stay the same as they are, but looking to the past, then what happens is more workers are taken on, people expand their hours of labour, and we move from C to D. And of course the same process occurs at D. Money illusion stops, and workers then have rational expectations. They realise inflation is going up 6%. They demand 6% wages. Firms pay 6% wages, but what they have to do is make some workers redundant because their costs have increased, and therefore you move from D to E, back to E. And you see all that happens. And Jim Callaghan, who was the Prime Minister in 1976, realised this. That's a Labour Prime Minister. He said, all that happens is we try and get unemployment lower by reflating the economy, we just end pumping more and more and more inflation into the economy. So you see at point E, inflationary expectations are much higher. They would be here or here, okay, corresponding to a high level of money supply. Okay, so this diagram can actually be explained quite neatly by the neoclassical long-run aggregate supply curve. So the neoclassical long-run aggregate supply curve refers to potential output. Okay, and this is your potential output, which corresponds to a certain level, the natural rate of unemployment. And if you want to reduce the natural rate of unemployment and form a new Phillips curve, should we do this in a different colour? If you can see that, I don't know. You could move the Phillips curve to the left. And indeed, you can move long-run aggregate supply to the right. But what you need to use is supply-side policies to do that, to increase productivity in the economy. Okay, let's look at how this explains this. So if we start off at A, okay, what happens is we then have a reflationary policy, we expand aggregate demand, and we end up at B. And so we end up at an output higher than the potential level of output. At B, however, the workers demand higher wages to keep pace with higher inflation, and more particularly there'll be a shortage of workers occurring, okay, at a higher level of output. And those shortages mean they can negotiate high wages. That's a key point. High wages result in higher costs to firms, and therefore the long-run aggregate supply curve will neatly move to the left to SOS2, and we move from point B to point C. And there we are back at our equilibrium, well, we're back at we're back at potential income, which corresponds, of course, to the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, so this is the key monetarist explanation. If you want to go yet more extreme, some monetarists, such as Professor Lucas, I think he also won a Nobel Prize, he argued that economic agents are always rational. There's no short-run trade-off, and everyone, as soon as there's an increase in the money supply and a reflation, that is priced into people's wage negotiations, and therefore there isn't even a short-run trade-off. That's assuming perfect rational expectations. Well, I'll leave you to think what you think about that, because what he'd argue is you don't have cyclical unemployment, and if you have an expansion aggregate demand, it won't solve that problem. You simply end up with more inflation. However, let's go back to stagflation and then the story, because some economists, some good Keynesian economists argue this is dubious. There is still, if you look at the data, a trade-off. It's just that the trade-off has shifted to the right, so we now have a Phillips curve that's shifted to the right. So PC2 could correspond to the 70s into the 80s when we did have a problem with inflation in a country like Britain and other Western rich countries. PC1 might refer to the 60s. And so all that happens is still a trade-off between inflation and unemployment, just a high rate of inflation and a high rate of unemployment. And a lot of Keynesian economists would argue that there's still, therefore, a trade-off, and people have adaptive expectations. And really what happened after the 80s and the 90s into the early 2000s is the Phillips curve simply moved back down to the left as we end up with low levels of inflation and low levels of unemployment. Anyhow, I think that sums up the key issues. So thank you very much for watching. Have a nice day.